Grace, all these visits to the doctors are useless. Don't you understand that? Said Roger irritably. Will you stop whining? Instead of reproaching me all the time, you'd better suggest something concrete, replied his wife. I've told you before, but you can't hear me. I don't believe she can be cured, and this consultation won't solve anything either. Roger stood and walked out of the rooms. Grace was hurt to hear such words from her husband, who did not believe in the recovery of their little daughter Lucy. Despite the disappointing doctor's prognoses, Grace didn't lose hope. Lucy was only 5 years old, and a few months ago the child was diagnosed with a terrible brain tumour. Lucy was feeling unwell all the time, suffering from severe headaches, and she constantly vomited. Her parents took her to different clinics, but due to the complicated location of the tumour, none of the doctors wanted to perform the dangerous surgery. Grace had the last hope for one of the most advanced clinics in the capital, where they drove to for a consultation. The next day they spent a long time in the office of a well-known doctor. He carefully looked at the images, thoughtfully studied the results of tests, and Grace could not stand it and asked whether he could help their daughter. The doctor put the documents in a pile, looked up at the woman, and shook his head in the negative. Unfortunately, no. We certainly do this kind of surgery, but your case is too complicated, said the doctor. We could try an alternative treatment, but that would only help to slightly delay the inevitable. But what should we do? Asked Roger in a droopy voice. The doctor replied that there was a good clinic in Munich with a lot of experience of this kind of surgery, and that this was the only chance for Lucy. Of course, the surgery would be very expensive there, and the doctor said that unfortunately he could only allocate money from the clinic's fund for a primary consultation. Further examination and surgery is only at your expense. In such cases, you need to involve charitable organizations or wealthy sponsors. Maybe then you can save a child. Grace was desperate. When they left the office, the woman cried. This is the last chance, and I don't want to give up. We have to go there at all costs, said Grace through her tears, and Roger only hugged his spouse silently. After leaving their daughter at the clinic, Grace and Roger went home. The next day, Grace called to various charities looking for any help at all. Roger was nervous and kept saying that nothing would work and that it was a waste of time and effort. In the evening, Grace barely lay down on her bed and immediately fell asleep from exhaustion. Roger, resentful, stayed in the living room watching TV. In the morning, Grace came out of the bedroom and saw Roger with a suitcase standing by the front door. Grace first looked at her husband in surprise, and then, noticing a note near the mirror with the single word, "Sorry," she guessed everything. Have you decided to run away? Is that the best you can do? Shouted Grace angrily, nodding at the note. Grace, did I tell you that everything is useless? My life is falling apart, and I no longer have the strength or desire to do it. But this is our daughter, and she needs us, exclaimed Grace. No, Lucy is not our daughter, and when we took her from the orphanage she was healthy. And now, no one can help her anymore. And even if they do an operation, she will never be a normal person. So I'm giving you one last chance. Either we take her back to the orphanage, or I'm leaving forever. Hearing these words, Grace suddenly became furious. Are you crazy? It's not like she's an item you can take back to the store under warranty. Whether they help her or not, I'll never leave her. So it's your choice. Are you going to leave by yourself, or do you need help? Roger sighed resentfully and already in the doorway said, I wonder what you're going to do without me. You haven't got a job, have you? But Grace just laughed. "You'd better think about how you're gonna live. Do you know how much cleaning, laundry, housing, and cooked food cost? You've never bothered with that, have you? And don't worry about me. I'll get by somehow." Roger left the apartment in silence, and Grace, sighing exhaustedly, collapsed on the sofa and cried. She anxiously asked what happened, and Grace, unable to stand it, burst into tears again and told her about the betrayal of her husband and the only chance to save Lucy. Her parents wanted to come to Grace to support her in such a difficult moment, but she dissuaded them. No need. Lucy and I will soon fly to Munich for a consultation. We'll see you when we get back." After speaking with her parents, Grace felt a little better, and after cleaning herself up, she went to get Lucy from the hospital. They quickly collected necessary documents, and within a week they were already sitting at the airport, waiting to board a flight to Munich. Lucy had been feeling unwell since the morning, and Grace poured juice into a disposable cup for the girl. The girl took the drink and awkwardly turned around and stumbled. The cup fell out of the girl's hands, and its contents splashed in the direction of the effective lady standing nearby, leaving bright stains on her snow-white, expensive suit. Grace began to apologize frightenedly, and the woman shouted something indignantly in German. Lucy cried, and Grace was very uncomfortable. When it was time to board the plane, Grace realized that this woman was also flying with them on the same flight, and worst of all, she turned out to be their seatmate. The flight was a real challenge for Grace and the German woman. Lucy got very sick and constantly vomited. The neighbour complained to the stewardesses, who even had to make some polite remarks to Grace. As soon as the plane landed, the German was the first to jump out of her seat and hurry to the exit. Grace and Lucy were met at the airport and immediately taken to a clinic. There they were put in a room and told that the doctor could see them in a couple of hours, but in the meantime they were offered a place to rest. At the appointed time, Grace and her daughter were invited into the office, where a mature, kind-looking man who introduced himself as Dr. Becker greeted them. The next minute, the very same lady from the airport entered the office. Grace almost lost her senses from surprise, but the woman, though also surprised, only said a discreet hello. "Hello, my name is Angela. I'm Dr. Becker's lawyer. But there was a force majeure today, and 2 of the clinic's interpreters got sick, so Dr. Becker asked me to be the interpreter. Let's get started." First, the doctor asked how long ago the first signs of the disease appeared, and Grace described everything in detail, talking about the headaches, constant nausea, loss of coordination, and much more. With each word, Angela's face became softer and more sympathetic in her eyes. Then the conversation turned to Grace's husband. The doctor wondered about his attitude toward the necessary surgery, and the woman informed the doctor that she was the only one responsible for Lucy, since her husband had left them. "Grace, the doctor asks if you have any relatives in your family with a similar condition." "You see, Lucy is not my biological daughter. We took the girl from an orphanage when she was not even 6 months old." Angela, who was already struggling to hold back tears, heard the last phrase, apologized and left the office for a while, and when she returned, it was clear that she had been crying. The doctor, however, was calm. He scheduled the necessary tests and advised everyone to rest for now. In the ward, Lucy immediately fell asleep, and Grace lay down next to her and thought about Angela's unexpected reaction to her words. It was obvious that the girl's story had touched this woman deeply. Suddenly there was a knock at the door. Angela came in and asked Grace in a whisper to go into the hall and talk. "Grace, forgive me for my behaviour at the airport and especially on the plane. I don't know what came over me. I just so often meet ill-mannered children who behave ugly in public places, and their parents let them do everything, so I couldn't help myself. I'm so ashamed." "Come on, Angela. I understand everything. Lucy's behaviour often seems strange to people who don't know her illness, and I'm sorry we spoiled your beautiful costume." "Don't worry, the dry cleaner will fix everything. Dr. Becker said the tests tomorrow would take time until lunchtime. I would like to invite you and Lucy to my house for dinner," said Angela, and looked questioningly at Grace. "I don't even know. Is that appropriate? What if Lucy wouldn't feel well? And how would your husband react to that?" "I'll pick you up and take you back. My husband Peter is German, but he treats my compatriots well and will be delighted," smiled Angela. The woman's words seemed so warm and sincere that Grace could not refuse. The next evening, Angela took them to her home. The atmosphere was friendly, and they all had a wonderful evening together. Angela translated for Peter everything Grace said, and the man also felt sympathy for the little girl. Towards the end of the evening, Grace was going back to the hospital, but Angela and Peter suggested they spend the night at their house. Grace refused at first, but after thinking hard, she agreed. "Hooray, Mummy, I love you so much," rejoiced Lucy, and asked Angela's permission to play with the beautiful doll that stood on the shelf by the fireplace. Grace looked sternly at her daughter, but Angela said with a smile, "Grace, it's all right. Of course, take it, dear." The evening was drawing to a close. Lucy, who had been feeling surprisingly well all day, quickly fell asleep, and Peter, after excusing himself, also went to his bedroom. Grace and Angela were left alone in the kitchen. "Grace, tell me, why did you and your husband decide to take a child from the orphanage?" "I couldn't get pregnant for a long time," Grace answered sadly. "But there are so many treatments now. Have you tried anything?" "No, my husband was against it and thought it was all just a waste of money. He thought I was infertile, so somehow I went along with it and didn't argue." Then the conversation turned to surgery. Angela tried her best to reassure Grace, because Dr. Becker was sure that the tumour was benign, and after its removal, the girl would be healthy. "Yes, this is my dream, but there are so many obstacles in the way," Grace said sadly. "Money?" guessed Angela at once. Grace said that she had only paid for the flight and the primary consultation, and had not yet been able to raise the money for the rest. Angela promised to do something about it. She had many friends and clients who she was sure would want to help. "Thank you, Angela. Only we're not talking about 1,000. If we lived in a big city, I would sell the apartment right away. But we live in a small town. Prices for housing are low. My parents are also willing to do whatever it takes, but it's a drop in the ocean." "Everything will be fine. You'll see," said Angela, and wiped tears from her eyes. Lucy and Grace stayed in the hospital for a few more days. When all examinations were completed, the doctor rejoiced the girl's mother and informed her that the tumour was benign, and the most important thing now was not to delay the surgery. In the evening, Angela saw them off at the airport. They said goodbye to Grace as close friends, and Angela left Lucy the doll that the girl liked so much. Lucy kissed Angela gently on the cheek and said, "You're kind. I'll miss you." Angela could barely contain herself from bursting into tears and stood looking after them until they disappeared through the terminal doors. At home, all Grace could think about was how to raise the money for her daughter's surgery and rehabilitation. Some money began to come into the account, but the sums were small. Time passed, but the situation did not change much. Grace was about to give up, but suddenly the phone rang. It was Angela. "Grace, I have good news. Lucy's operation has been paid for." "Paid for? But by whom?" asked Grace confusedly. "I don't know. The sender wished to remain anonymous. I contacted many businessmen I know. Maybe someone decided to help. Does it really matter? The main thing is that Lucy will have an operation." Grace could still not believe that this was possible. She questioned Angela several times and then, when there were no doubts left, burst into tears of happiness. Later, after she calmed down a little, she told her parents the good news, booked the tickets, and then she remembered that she, again, needed Roger's permission for Lucy to go abroad. She immediately called him. "Are you going to Germany again? You've been doing that a lot. Do you have a rich sponsor?" asked Roger defiantly. "What do you care? Just give your approval, that's all." "Lucy is my daughter too, or are you the only one who can fly abroad every now and then, and I have to almost starve to death here?" "What nonsense! Will you give your consent or not?" exclaimed Grace, not yet understanding what Roger was getting at. "I will, but not for nothing," declared Roger. Grace gradually began to understand. She asked directly what he wanted, and her husband replied that she should compensate him for her trip to Germany with his daughter in the form of €1,000. "Are you crazy? Aren't you ashamed?" screamed Grace, unable to believe that her husband had stooped to this. "If you shame me more, then the amount will increase. When you decide, call me," answered Roger, and hung up. Grace could not believe what she heard for a long time. She could think plenty of things about Roger, but she could not even imagine such a meanness. There was nothing to do. She had to agree to not waste time in the court. A week later, Grace and Lucy flew to Munich. The operation was difficult, but it was a success. Angela and Peter contacted Grace all the time. After a month, Dr. Becker said that Lucy could go home. Angela tried to persuade her friend to stay in Germany and even hinted that she might marry one of Angela's friends, a decent man who really liked Grace. But Grace had no idea how she could live so far away from the homeland and her parents, and did not dare to change her life so drastically. At the airport, Grace said that she would never forget what Angela had done for Lucy, and that God himself had sent her to help them. 2 years passed. Grace met a kind and attentive man, David, who was the opposite of Roger, and finally felt loved and protected. With Angela and Peter, they saw each other several times a year on holidays. Lucy had fully recovered and had almost no recollection of the disease she had suffered. One day, the doorbell rang, and David went to open it. Roger was standing on the doorstep with a bouquet. He looked wrinkled and a little drunk. "Daddy, who's come to see us?" asked Lucy, who ran up and became silent when she saw Roger. At that time, Grace came up as well. Roger looked at the perfectly healthy girl, moved his gaze to Grace's visibly rounded belly, then to David, and, realizing he was not welcome, muttered, "I'm the courier. Here, this is for you." He handed a bouquet of rather shabby roses to David and glumly wandered down the stairs. Lucy, Grace, and David looked at each other and laughed in unison. David hugged his wife and daughter tenderly and said sincerely, "How happy I am to have you in my life.